Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's program, part two of our series on land banks as a tool for rural redevelopment, brought to you by the University of Illinois Extension and Rural Partners, the voice of rural Illinois. My name is Mike Delaney, and I'm an Extension County Community and Economic Development educator based in Ogle County in northern Illinois. We're going to begin with some quick housekeeping notes. They'll be familiar to most of you. Please note that if you desire, you can activate Zoom's closed captioning feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll be recording today's webinar and making it available on Extension's YouTube channel. After the conclusion of today's presentation, registered participants will receive an email with links to materials and to the recording of the webinar. If you didn't receive an email with links to the materials, and please don't worry about it, just drop your email in the chat box and we will make sure that you get a copy of the recording and the materials at the conclusion of the presentation when we send out the follow-up email. As always, you're welcome at any time to share your questions in the Zoom chat space. We will be reviewing the questions in a Q&A period following the main presentation, so don't despair if we don't immediately respond to the question in the chat. I'm now delighted to introduce today's moderator, Brian White of eProperty Innovations. Brian brings 2 decades of community and economic development expertise to his work advising local governments and land banks on how to reactivate property. Brian will introduce our other presenters, Dr. Victoria Livingston, the Executive Director at Prairie Hills Resource Conservation and Development, which works in a number of counties in West Central Illinois, and Scott Goldstein, a community planner and president of Tesca Associates of Evanston, Illinois. Brian, the podium's yours.
Thanks, Mike. And thanks everybody for joining us. I'm happy to be here for the second of this series on land banking in Illinois, and we're focusing obviously on land banks for rural communities and smaller, lower capacity communities. So as we've been waiting to get started, and as Mike was doing the introduction, I was kind of looking at the chat. It looks like most of the people who are on the call or on the meeting today attended the first one. So I have some slides prepared, but I'm going to probably skip through them pretty quickly. If you are one of the people who did not attend the first session, obviously you could watch the video that was created of it. But I am going to sort of skip over so we have more time for questions, because I think the first session we had was really talking about what land banks are and kind of just helping people understand conceptually and as a practical matter what some of the basics of land banking is or are. Today, we really want to dig into the operational aspect. And so we're fortunate to have 2 speakers for our sessions who have a lot of experience. One, Scott Goldstein, who's been working through the IDA Technical Assistance Program to provide technical assistance to land banks that have been forming in Illinois for the last number of years. And then Vicki is one of our partners in the western part of Illinois and is actually working right now to create a land bank. And so being able to draw on Vicki's experience trying to get the land bank stood up and operationalized with her local municipal partners, I think is really helpful and instructive. And then Scott's also going to be able to share some of the lessons learned and best practices, not only from the land banking work, but obviously from his deep experience as a planner and as a community planner. So I think we're going to have a good session. In terms of myself, as Mike mentioned, my name is Brian White. I'm the General Manager and Director of Strategic Engagement, with eProperty Innovations. So we're a company based in Chicago that works across the country with various types of organizations that are in the process of forming land banks or working on community revitalization strategies, where identifying, acquiring, and stabilizing vacant and distressed property is central to their work. So most of our clients are local governments or nonprofit community development organizations. And most, but not all, are in what we would consider land bank states, which are states that have enabling legislation or statutes at the state level that allows for expedited creation of land banks. Illinois is not one of those states. We don't have that kind of legislation. So the folks who work in Illinois on land banking tend to be much more creative about exercising existing powers and authorities to perform the same types of activities. So if you were to go after today's session online and look up land banks, you're going to see examples from around the country, and it's really important as you're digesting this information and trying to understand how land banks operate is that you are aware of the distinctions between what can be done in Illinois versus other states, because there are some pretty significant differences. Okay, so I have some slides. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and see if I can get the slides up on screen. And whoops. And I will go through these relatively quickly since these are going to be mostly review for everybody. Is everybody able to see my screen? I think that's a yes. Yes, Mayor Wood says yes. Okay, uh, so just as a quick recap, when we think about what land banks are, we think about them in terms of their single purpose entity. They have a very specific focus. They're formed by local governments, and their focus is on efficiently restoring vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated property back to productive reuse. Um, I think as we get into this question about operationalizing land banks, the key things of what land banks do are the things on screen, but what we really want to focus on today is how do we put these into particular order? What's the priority when we're getting started? Where do we begin? So typically when we're talking about forming land banks, the first thing that we're really focusing on is identifying your assets and starting to triage your properties into some kind of a understandable set of tranches or inventories where you can start to realize some properties we have in our inventories might be salvageable, some might have historic significance, some might just be demolition candidates, or they're properties that are structurally obsolete or too small or in the wrong location of our communities, and therefore we need to remove those structures and convert that land to something else. So where we oftentimes want to focus, at least from our work, is we want to focus on what is the inventory of properties that you are potentially going to be working on and why, and letting your strategy drive the decisions about the properties that you have or that you're going to start to tackle. Second thing is we really focus on trying to develop systems. So land banks are addressing the inefficiency of how government operations work or the limitations that are placed on government so that due process and fairness and equity and so forth. There's many things that are written into the law that are important and positive, but the net result is it often can result in a very inefficient, cumbersome process. And when you're dealing with very low value distressed property, anything you can do to alleviate or remove some of those impediments to getting the properties out quickly is to your benefit because the asset is going to lose value as time goes on. So creating these sorts of systems is a big part of it, and that's a challenging thing. And so we're going to be talking today about how you set up those systems. What are some of the tools that you could utilize to help operationalize a land bank if you decided to move ahead? In terms of what they do, I just wanted to kind of touch on that land banks can work on a number of different property strategies. So in the Prairie Hills area, a lot of the work has been done around brownfield identification, and so we're going to be talking about brownfields and how brownfields are being addressed by land banks. They can work on obviously residential or commercial projects, downtown corridor projects, a whole range of things. So I think we're going to hear about more of that also today. Land banks are operating using existing government authorities. So your land banks are typically going to have a member who has home rule power, and the powers that are then granted or extended to the land bank are extending from what are already available to your local governments. And so that was a topic we talked about at the previous session. I also just wanted to highlight that Illinois has some great examples of regional land banks, one of which would be Prairie Hills. And so there's some real benefits in Illinois about how we can have land banks working across jurisdictions and geographic boundaries. The last thing I think we can touch on or mention is just that the idea of having a land bank is that the land bank is going to have staff and expertise that is pretty unique for your local governments. Obviously, if you're in a smaller community with limited staff and limited capacity, you're not going to have some of the specialized knowledge or the specialized expertise that might be available at some of the larger communities. And so land banks are helping to provide sort of a marginal staffing or a marginal service that you would not otherwise have. And so ideally, the land bank is structured in a way that allows you as a municipal member or participant to draw from the land bank what you need for your specific community and contribute back to it what is marginally necessary to help support its operations. And I think Vicky's done some great work creating a structure that helps to provide some operating support for land banks going forward as they tackle different types of projects. As I wrap up my portion of the presentation and turn over to Vicky to present on what's been happening with Prairie Hills, I just wanted to put this other slide up here in terms of identifying some of the key elements of success and really the next slide, which is really about where do we, how do we get started? So in our work, and I think you're going to hear this from Scott as well, really it's important to define the problem and understand what it is, why are we creating this land bank? What is it trying to do? Working on community engagement and getting the leaders to understand what the potential is and what the limits are. Developing realistic operational frameworks. And then this is my own personal observation after having worked in the space for land banks. It's been 13 years. Community development, it's been closer to, I don't know, 20 or 25. You have to have a bias for action. I think what we talk about is that when you are forming any new entity, but especially something like a land bank, you have a window of opportunity to seize the initiative and start demonstrating success and progress. In order to do that, you have to have a bias for action. So land banks learn how things work. They learn how to process property through various operational frameworks and so forth by actually doing it. If you're looking at a land bank that's going to be getting formed and taking months and months and months to get off the ground, chances are the window of opportunity to seize that initiative is going to start to close on you. And once it closes, it's very hard to restart that. So if you look around the country and you look at where there have been successful land banks, they're typically getting started and immediately taking action to address immediate problems that are right in front of them, and then building some of the pipeline, some of the larger strategies as they go. And there's definitely a learn by doing aspect to this work. So I think you're going to hear again more of that as we get into the presentations. So let me just sort of stop there. I know I kind of went over this very quickly, but again, I'm mindful that most of us have been through this presentation for the most part previously, and I really wanted to leave a lot of our time for Vicky and for Scott's presentation, and then for your questions. So what'll be happening as we go forward is I'll be watching the questions that are coming into chat, and I will be selecting questions to respond to, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can in the time that we have. So thanks for that. And now I want to turn it over to Vicky. And Vicky, I can't see my screen, but I would ask you, are you ready to take over?
Well, actually, we're going to turn it over to Scott, and then it's
To
Mike.
Scott, I am sorry. I got myself out of order, and
Okay.
Scott was so pleasant and polite
Either way works.
not to call attention to my mistake. So, okay, Scott, are you ready to take over?
Absolutely.
And in
Awesome.
fact, let me jump in for just a moment. We're going to take just a second and launch a quick poll with the first question to get a little sense, Scott, before you get started, about what the folks' level of familiarity is. So just take 10 seconds, one question, give us your responses, and then we'll get going with Scott. All right, Scott, why don't you go ahead and start rolling?
Okay. So actually, that poll is perfect. So most of you, according to the poll, are pretty new to land banks, have some familiarity and want to learn more. So you're in the right place. Did that screen share work?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Um, so I think a lot of you were at the first meeting, and you just heard from Brian, and we're glad to see the interest today. But why join a land bank? And primarily that's due to abandoned vacant properties. I'm president of Tusk Associates. We're celebrating our 50th year. We've worked in almost all parts of the state, and every community is different. But throughout the state, there are issues of abandoned vacant properties in almost every community. And this is a tool, as Brian talked about, that's been used extensively in other parts of the country. And it's a great tool in Illinois. And the way they've been moving forward in Illinois, there's some advantages not to having state legislation, provides actually quite a bit of flexibility. So we'll get into that a little bit. But it's also what land banks are in Illinois is an intergovernmental approach because housing markets don't stop at your municipal boundary, of course. And this is a way to cooperate with your neighbors for a more systemic approach. And once the land banks really get going, we can reduce the time and act very responsively, as Brian was talking about, rather than wait for the problems to get worse. And unfortunately, in our tax system in Illinois, it makes it very difficult to address things quickly, and that's what land banks can do. It also provides economies of scale and cost savings to individual communities by pooling those sort of central staff and infrastructure costs together. And it's also an ability to compete for grants. And so there's a lot of different grants in the state. We always know it's challenging, and the government horizon is challenging, but this is a way to demonstrate impact and have the capacity to respond to grants quickly to be able to address the issues. As we talked about last time, there's 8 land banks across Illinois. Here's the logos. They vary from very, very large land banks in terms of volume, like a county land bank in South Suburban, Northern Illinois, to ones that are just getting started. And some of those representatives are here today, and that are doing a fantastic job in more emerging land banks where they're starting to tackle properties. Here they are mapped. And so the existing land banks cover 60% of the population of Illinois, but you can see not 60% of the land area. So there's a lot of room to either create a land bank or join an existing land bank. You'll see in here that they do not have to be contiguous. It's nice if they're contiguous. There's no reason why an intergovernmental agreement can't be chosen for communities that have similar issues but are not necessarily adjacent to each other. The issues of abandoned properties unfortunately pervade most communities, and there's a lot of economies by scale working together. In some cases, these are based on existing groups of municipalities like Quad Cities that already had working relationships. In some cases, there's our communities to come together. Brent last time went through some of the tools of acquisition. And so if you think about buckets, the big buckets are acquisition, maintenance, holding properties, and disposition. I'll talk about the difference between land banks and land trusts in a minute, but land banks, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about this, are not about banking land in large holdings. It's really about having an exit strategy upfront to acquire land, determine strategy, or really determine strategy before you acquire the land, and then convey that through a sale or other conveyance to a responsible taxpayer. So a lot of this focus, there's a question came in where the 5 most important things to do to be effective in a land bank. Number 1 is identify properties. That's the hardest part. It's complex in Illinois. There are various ways to do that. I put some of them on the right here in that gray box. But essentially in the tax foreclosure system, there are different categories of tax sales, tax deed sales, and really trying to arrest those properties from further decline. And that's often done through an abandonment petition. So if the property owner has not paid the property taxes for over 2 years, it's possible to go to court and show that if they basically meet 3 steps, they haven't paid their property taxes, they haven't paid their water, and there's a determination on site that nobody's living in the property and no one has an interest. There's different court procedures to show that. But at the end of the day, that the court could determine that that property was abandoned. And so the cost of acquiring the property is really just the cost of legal services. Brad Denson and other attorneys throughout the state can help you through that process. And it comes in about $5,000 a property. So it's a very efficient, takes some time, but it's a very efficient way to acquire property. There's also tax deed sales and trustee auctions for those are properties that have already gone through tax foreclosure typically, and be able to convey those either buying them from the trustee or having it conveyed from the trustee to the land bank, which they can do. And many of you may already be doing that as a local government. Donations, there can be tax advantages for a taxpayer to donate that property to the land bank and absolve the past property tax debt on that property if it's structured correctly. A fee in lieu arrangement, and then code enforcement lien foreclosure. That's the other major way land banks acquire properties. And a lot of communities, some of you on the call probably may not have a full-time code inspector, maybe one who collaborate with other properties. But code enforcement does 2 things. Number 1, hopefully land bank properties don't have to end up in a land bank. Effective code enforcement can sometimes result in that property being brought up to code. And if it's not, there's a means way to do that for essentially go to court similar to abandonment and through lien foreclosures acquire that property. So then the second part is to hold the land, and the third part is to dispose of the land. And like we said, you really should have your exit strategy before step one. So you're acquiring property because you've got some possible use for that property. In terms of vacant land, side lots. So you're essentially selling to the property for a couple $100 to an adjacent or nearby homeowner or other property owner that essentially gets that property for a very small cost. The taxes are cleared from the past, and that property owner now has to take care of the property, mow the grass, pay the taxes on the property. Is a very small fee usually. Development lots for future development, and a lot of in a lot of places it might be certain lots that are vacant in a subdivision that failed. So trying to get the back taxes cleared so you could get those properties back moving, or older lots in established neighborhoods. It could be used for a playground. It could be used for eventually building new housing. Some land banks are looking into partnerships with manufactured housing to get new units up there. And then there is a role for land vacant for future projects. So your members, typically municipalities or counties, may have a larger project that they want to work on, and the land bank can act very quickly to work with that municipality to acquire those properties. For example, a hospital. So there's a land bank that did that to work with a older hospital network that was consolidating, creating a modern new facility. They needed help to acquire that land. So the land bank was able to step in and do that and get that property assembled for that new healthcare provider. In terms of selling structures, so Joe Van Dyke last time talked about this in detail. So a lot of land banks have three different types of categories. One as is immediate board up and those types of things, but basically sold as is with a restriction to make sure to bring that home back to code in a certain period of time. The next is to stabilize and repair, so modest renovations to bring the property up to a point where it could be sold in the market. And again, you want to have assurances that it will be brought up to code, and then full rehab. So that hasn't been done as much. It's more expensive, but it's a very efficient compared to a lot of other types of programs. The cost differential we can talk about in this Q&A could be very favorable to create new housing. Almost all of this housing, it's not required by any land bank in Illinois, I don't think, but almost all this housing, if you look at the income levels of the people who become either the buyers or the eventual occupants, are almost always within the definition of the standard definition of affordable housing at 80% of area median income for homeowners or 60% of renters. It is not required by any land bank, I don't think, unless certain programs they're working on. But the net result is we're getting more affordable housing throughout the state through a locally driven process that doesn't have a lot of restrictions to it compared to other programs. Okay, so there's a lot of questions about what's the difference between a land bank and a land trust. Could be the same organization running both, but typically they're two different purposes. Land banks really are focused on distressed properties, typically in areas that have some issues going on that are holding back the housing market. And their function is really to bring those properties back into productive use. They're not really intended to hold properties for a long period of time. That it is that case in other states and Genesee County and other places where they have very, very large land banks. But generally in Illinois, it's about recycling those properties and getting them back to market. In some ways, land trusts are kind of the opposite. Land trusts are about typically buying land that's either used for affordable housing in areas where prices are really going up very quickly, or for open space, conservation land trusts. So land trusts are really designed to make sure that that property, the return on that property, stays reasonable over time, and so that housing unit can stay affordable over time. Oftentimes, the land trust continues to own the land, and then there's a house on top of it that is owned by the homeowner. So we can talk about that more in the Q&A. And I want to make sure to leave enough time for Vicky, so I'm going to go over a couple of these other concepts. Member engagement. So land banks are all voluntary organizations where each member municipality or county is joining and signing an intergovernmental agreement to work together. That means the central core of the land bank really needs to have very, very strong member engagement and follow the priorities of each of its members, and they may be similar, but they might be different. So typically, each land bank's members have slightly different needs. Some of them might be more in acquisition, some of them might be more in repair, roof repair, for example. And some of them really might be marketing existing properties that the municipality acquired over time, but needs help in getting those back to market. So what's really important there is to have clear roles for each party. So there's an annual work plan that lays out the agenda for the upcoming year. In Illinois, all of the land banks are based on local member direction. In other parts of the country, it's not that way. But here in Illinois, they're all based on the local members and what they want to do. So they all say, we're not going to acquire property in your community without your knowledge and approval of acquiring that property. And so that's been an arrangement that's really worked very well. Vicky's going to talk about this more, but really, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking about, okay, I'm interested. What do I have to do to get started? Well, the number one thing, and Brian covered this, what are your needs? First in housing, and then also economic development, and for some open space as well. So really understanding what those needs are. If you're a home ruled municipality, you have all this authority to do it right now. So really the question is, what are the benefits of working together with your neighbors to do it more comprehensively? And the way to test that is to do a budget. And we would recommend at least a 3-year budget to start with, itemizing what those expenses are, staffing, admin expenses. To be eligible for many grants, you need to have an annual audit. So you got to figure in the cost of the annual audit, software, open space insurance, and then the revenue. So that comes through a variety of sources. I'm going to leave it to Vicky, but the new model in most areas of growing land banks in Illinois is to have a small member contribution that can pay for some of those common costs. Those are very low, typically under 10,000 for very, very small communities, maybe $30,000, $40,000 for larger communities, less than repairing a sidewalk. But it makes sure every member is contributing to those common costs, will be participating on the board, and really be active and engaging in the land bank. The other revenue is grants. There are various grant programs that IDA has, that DCO has. And again, having some essential grant writer really helps for that. And then fee for service and property sales. So Joe, last time from South Suburban, really talked about in their market, they've been able to do very well, essentially through the legal expenses of buying the property and then selling the property for additional value and using the differential to reinvest in the next project. That's really the classic case of a land bank. Not all areas of Illinois are there yet. It may take some time to get to the point where we're actually able to build the market to the extent that you're able to sell those properties for more than what it costs to acquire them. I mentioned that in Illinois, all of the land banks other than Cook County are based on intergovernmental agreements, with the Reston Authority being at least one home rule member. Last thing I wanted to talk about is the impact of land banks and show some examples of existing land banks in Illinois. And when you think about if you had a vacant property, it's really bringing down the property values of all their neighbors. And so we start to think about rings around that property. Even if it's just a demolition, you're taking away a negative element. If you're building new housing, even better. And we tend to see through the research of about 10 to 15% return of nearby properties by taking action. And so that's something that's building the tax base. So here's some examples. Quad Cities Land Bank Authority, I think Mary Chappell's on the call, is the executive director. And you can see in this case, this is Rock Island, Moline, East Moline, and Silvis. And this is a heat map of showing some of the programs that they've used either through the land bank or their member communities, primarily the Strong Communities program, and how over time they are really focusing in on certain census tracts that have the highest vacancy rate this is Rock Island County. This is on the Illinois side. And you can see that they've been very strategic in terms of how they're focusing on those properties. Here you've got a close-in view of showing specifically Rock Island and Moline. They were each doing work on their own, and now they're also able to work together. In some cases for grants, you can actually apply separately and together. So you're able to get multiple sources of funding in. It's a lot of work to get this done, but you can see again, when you focus on these close-in views, a mixture of acquisition. They're just getting started with some rehab now, particularly in Rock Island, demolition of properties, maintenance, and some properties have multiple interventions. Over time, this is going to grow, and hopefully we get to the point that the market takes us on. And in terms of housing vacancy rates, you can see all these communities have vacancy rates Most of them, at least at the statewide average, or higher, but often it's concentrated in certain parts of the community that they're really focusing on. Kankakee Regional Land Bank Authority was formed by the city of Kankakee as well as the county of Kankakee. That's why it's the Kankakee Regional Land Bank. And so we're able to work jointly. By the way, county activities can take place in the city as well. The way land banks are done in Illinois is they don't define the boundaries of activity land bank rather than it's the members of the land bank. That's the distinction there. So there's quite a bit of flexibility that's done. Most of the work that's been done has actually been in the city of Kankakee. They have a strong board that's half county members, half city members, common staff. Montel Crawford, great person to talk to. And here again, you see the lightest areas with the lowest home values where they've been focusing in on. And Kankakee, the city of Kankakee, has a vacancy rate of almost 18%. So it's really important to be able to do that. At the same time, Kankakee has a strong enough housing market to get some things done and housing rehabbed. And the last one, so we're mostly focused on rural communities, but I'd just give some compliments to South Suburban, what they've been able to do. They have 30 member communities throughout, they cross 2 counties, the southern end of Cook County, as well as northern Will County. So like that bright dot there, Park Forest is actually in both counties, mostly in Cook, but you can see that again, the activity is based on the municipal members and how many properties they bring to the table. So those communities that were really focused and ahead of the curve on that, you're going to see more activity in those pockets of the county. With that, I'm going to save some time. I have some other slides that we could talk about during the Q&A in terms of economic development, but I wanted to give time to what Vicky's been doing. Tremendous work, working with very small communities over a large area. Started on brownfields issues and expanded on that. And I think it's a great example of really great outreach that you're doing to get one member at a time to join a new land bank you're forming. So I'll give it over to you.
And Scott, that was great. Just Vicky, I'm sorry, just to interject real quick. For folks that are on the chat, I am monitoring the questions that are coming in the chat, and other than the one that Scott referenced, I haven't seen any. So if you have a pressing question or even a non-pressing question, put your question in the chat. You will have a high probability of getting it answered because so far there's no competition. So just wanted to share that. Go ahead, Vicky. Thanks so much, Scott.
Thank you. And thanks, Scott, for that introduction. It's been a wild ride. I did notice during the poll that a lot of you said that you had heard of a land bank before, but you didn't really know much about it. And I can tell you that a year ago, I was in the same position. I had not, I'd heard the term land bank before, but I hadn't really dove into it a whole lot. So hopefully you'll get some good information today and feel the confidence to be able to go and do that. So as they've mentioned, I'm the executive director of Prairie Hills Resource Conservation and Development, and that is important for a couple of reasons. And so we were originally formed back in the 70s through NRCS and their RC&D program. We are a registered nonprofit already working in our community, and we do all of this other stuff. So Scott alluded to having a conservation land trust and the differences between a land bank and a land trust. And we formed a land trust back in 2008. So most of our land trust work is on the conservation side. So keeping things either in natural habitat or in agricultural space. We do hold some properties over in like Tazewell County where we're trying to keep things in ag space as opposed to urban sprawl. All of that feeds into this brownfield program that we started. And so we had gone through several iterations of unsuccessful grants until 2018 when we were awarded an EPA brownfields grant. And since then, we have had two fully completed grants, and we are awaiting the awarding of our third one. So it has been awarded to us, but we haven't kicked off that grant period yet. All of that to say that our brownfield program is the reason we stumbled into land banking. And so we work on a variety of brownfield properties, excuse me, but all of those properties for our specific grant funding are limited to industrial and commercial property. And so you have some examples here. These are properties that we have worked on in not too recent years, but not too far in the past either. Places that you probably have in your communities already. A lot of the communities that I've talked with have buildings that look exactly like this. There's a junior high building that nobody was using anymore, main streets that have been boarded up, places that used to be filling stations that are no longer active. We recognized we had a lot of problems. We had a lot of these properties. We had out-of-state landowners. We had situations where landowners maybe still lived in the state, but they were not cooperative, or they were just unable to take care of the potential contamination in their space. Our brownfield grants allow us to do things like phase 1 assessments, which tell us, historically speaking, is this property likely contaminated? And phase 2 assessments, where you actually go out and take soil samples or air samples and look for contamination. So what do you actually have on the ground? Trying to work on a lot of these properties, we were running into a lot of walls, again, with those property owners that I mentioned. I mean, I can give you several examples of areas where we were not able to work fast enough, and the property ended up in very rough condition, and the city ended up on the hook for um, a lot of cleanup bills, a lot of cleanup costs are associated with these places. So we started to really sit down and ask, what can we do about this? Right? There are a lot of benefits to looking at those brownfield areas. I know a lot of our land bank conversation has been focused on housing, but I do want to mention these things as well. So looking at your current corridors and entry points into your cities, how can you rejuvenate those places if they need that? What can we be doing in those areas we've already built? Bringing your focus back to the heart of your cities and your heart of your municipalities instead of looking at green fields. I come at this type of problem from a three-dimensional space. We have areas we've built on already that aren't doing anything. We have areas that we don't want to be building on in the future. And we have areas that maybe just need a little TLC. Because we also run a conservation land trust, we are very interested in maintaining green spaces. So preventing our municipalities from getting wider and wider and ignoring their centers is really important to us. We also recognize that blighted properties impact everybody else's property values. And so if we can fix a few, then we raise property values for everybody, and a rising tide raises all ships. And in communities where you have 500 people, it looks like a county-wide tide is necessary. And so we want to make those connections as well. We also recognize that we have some historical places that we're losing, and we want to try to prevent that loss if possible. Through our brownfield program, we look at all of this technical assistance. We run all of the phase 1 and phase 2 assessments, and we can help pick up a lot of the costs for all of the planning purposes, but cleanup costs are not covered by our grant. And so what we find is that we identify the contamination, we make some suggestions on what to be done with it, and then nothing happens, either because the city is not confident that they can take care of it, the city doesn't have the funds to take care of it, the property owner may not have the funds to take care of it. Remediation when the EPA is involved is really expensive. So maybe there's a better way to go about things. We also recognize that this community redevelopment grant supports us in a lot of the technical assistance and planning side, and a lot of our smaller communities find that really beneficial. They don't have the staff capacity or time to be able to work on those things, and so we can fill in some of those gaps as well. But we are limited to industrial and commercial space. As we've mentioned, everybody needs housing. Everybody's housing needs look a little bit different, but everybody needs housing at this point. We have those out-of-state landowners. We have properties that are no longer on the tax roll, so we're not bringing in any income on those spaces. And we just need a lot more support in these rural communities where we have less than 1,000 people, or maybe less than 2,500 people. And so we need more tools, right? And that is where our land bank comes in. So through the brownfield program, it felt very much like a 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon type of thing, where a friend of a friend of a friend connected us to eProperty Innovations, and we were able to start a feasibility study. So Brian and I connected in July of last year. We met face-to-face in August, and we did a 2-day whirlwind tour of 5 counties worth of people. So we hit municipalities that were interested in hearing more about the land bank. We talked to county boards. We spent 2 days driving around looking at some of these problems with windshield tours and IDing things. Our study found that we have significant needs across the region, which I don't think was a surprise, but it did highlight that this could potentially be economically viable. Not necessarily through its own property sales all of the time, but with grants and state support, and some federal support even, then we can continue to do this and it will work. It's not something that will automatically bottom out. In January of 25, we started holding monthly meetings for interested parties to provide updates, to talk about particular documentation in one space, like to give people an hour of their month to go through some of these details and all of this information. We looked at our draft IGA, which we patterned after other land banks in the state of Illinois. We distributed that to potential interested parties in February. We got a little bit of feedback, but for the most part, it's pretty boilerplate. So people weren't terribly concerned with making edits to that document. But with the IGA, we included a per capita fee request. So the IGA stipulates that if you sign on to our land bank, you agree to give us a 3-year commitment and $3 per capita on an annual basis. We sort of looked at how land banks had functioned across other parts of the state and recognized that funding was the really important piece. And if we could add a small per capita fee, then we allow ourselves a little bit more stability because we can focus more on projects and less on chasing more grants to be able to pay our overhead. Also pairing this with our existing organization, we can cover some of that overhead through our current programs and reduce our total cost at the end of the year. I have told municipalities at the end of 3 years, if you feel like you're not getting enough bang for your buck, or you feel like you could be putting that money toward other use within your own communities, that is their option. They can bow out after 3 years and no hard feelings. But I'm cautiously optimistic that after the end of 3 years, they will recognize the value of this program and they will stay. I've continued to visit a lot of individual communities. I talk to a lot of city council committees, county boards. I'm answering a lot of questions, right? As most of you on the call today, most of our municipalities had not heard of a land bank either. I mean, so giving them the basic information and then more specifics about how we would like to run our operations has been really helpful for them. And I would hazard a guess that several of them are on the call today based on the names that I saw earlier. So you can probably connect with them in the chat if you'd like to know from a municipality perspective. As of right now, we have 2 official signatories. So 2 communities have signed on. We're continuing to work with other communities to continue to answer their questions. And we do have some grant support at this point. Other applications are pending. So my personality type is to not sit and wait. If there's a deadline that looks like it might work, I'm going to put in an application and see what I can get. And some of those things have come to fruition at this point. Some of them are pending. So I would argue to keep an eye on all of the things at the same time if you can, because those grants do come around once a year, and so you don't want to be waiting on those applications either. We have focused on scaling potential outcomes based on participating communities, so we can do things with the member communities we have as we continue to gain more members. Looking at property inventory, continuing to look at funding, and we hope to hire 2 staff by the end of 2025. At this point, I think I need 6 communities to really pull my budget together, and I have 2 out of 6, and so we'll see where it goes from there. But as Brian and Scott can probably attest, I am an eternal optimist, and so I think it's going to be just fine. Our organization, again, does include a conservancy. We are an accredited land trust, so we do have a reputation in the communities we're working in already. We hold over 2,400 acres of natural habitat in West Central Illinois, either as the owner of those properties or as the holder of their conservation easement. It does kind of seem as odds in some conversations. Like I support economic development, and then on the other hand, I don't. But this is 2 sides of the same coin in my world. So redeveloping vacant properties protects our existing green space. And there are opportunities for some of our blighted properties to become small parks or places for farmers markets to be set up, areas that might be more suitable for those communities based on what their needs are. I tend to not cross things off the list until someone gives me a reason to cross it off the list. I am working with a property owner right now who had a pottery factory. He's been working with IEPA to try to take care of things. We're probably getting the US EPA grant involved, but he would really love to turn it into a city park. It will require more effort and more cleanup, but it's it's positioned well in that neighborhood that they could use green space. It would also provide potential farmers market space for that neighborhood, and it wins all the way around. That particular location is not suitable for housing. It's relatively small in terms of development for industry, so green space is the way to go. I would also argue that there is reason to listen to things like nature made solutions. I'm an ecologist by training. That's where my doctorate comes from. So economics was totally new to me, but ecology has taught me everything is connected, and I don't think economics is any different. Working in our communities has a few challenges, some things that have added to my success, I think, based on what these guys tell me on a semi-regular basis. I go where the people are. I go meet people where they are. We go see things in person. We visit in person, multiple means of communication. I regularly remind my younger staff that some folks are not going to read all of their emails. They are not going to pay attention to every digital newsletter. But if I send it on paper, they will read it and they will respond to me. And so multiple means of communication. I am persistent. So regular contact, regular phone calls, lots of follow-ups, lots of additional meetings, but I think it's worth it in the end. And patience. I'm also that type of person where if I have a job to do, it's going to get done and it's going to be on my timeline. And I have had to learn some patience through this whole process because the government moves slowly. It just is what it is. So for people who aren't familiar with what a land bank is, or communities who have not really seen this type of work before, there can be a little bit of a level of distrust. And so patience and persistence have really come to bear fruit in this case. I would also say that the two communities that I've signed off on are the community I work in and the community I live in. And that makes a huge difference, I think. People see me outside of the office all the time. And so the fact that they can connect with me on the sidewalk pretty much any time of day works to our advantage. And I feel like I went through that really fast, but the chat has exploded. So I assume that there are questions.
There are.
And of course, you can visit our website if you want to follow along updates on our land bank's progress. We have a blog and we have announcements about when we are in the news or when people have signed on. If you have questions after the meeting, you are welcome to email me.
Awesome. Thank you. And both presentations were great. And there are a lot of questions that came in. So because we're a little bit short on time, I'm going to take a quick stab at running through some of the quick questions that I can answer really fast. And I wanted to ask a couple of questions of our presenters. So one of the, or let me do that differently. Let me take a question that I think is a good segue from both what Scott and Vicky mentioned, and that's this notion that a land bank can really be valuable in attracting new resources to the land bank by having that, whether it's a grant writer or somebody who can corral some of the development expertise. So I wanted to kind of highlight one of the examples that Scott shared, which was from Central Illinois, where the slide showed a structure that was pretty deteriorated and dilapidated, and in many cases would have been a likely candidate for demolition. But by partnering with the land bank, they were able to actually, I think, salvage that property and attract someone to come and rehab it. So, Scott, do you have other examples you'd want to share or
Yeah,
kind
let
of talk
me,
about kind of that bringing
like in
capacity?
ballpark numbers. So let's say you're able to acquire that property through tax foreclosure. In this case, I think the city might have already owned it and conveyed it. And so your acquisition costs are very low, but your rehab costs are pretty high. So let's say it's costing $75,000 to $100,000 to rehab that property. And the comparables nearby of existing homes, so these are ballpark real numbers of $60,000 to $65,000. You're talking about a $50,000 to $75,000 subsidy to get a substandard property back into productive use. I don't know of another program out there that's that efficient.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an incredible bargain. So some people say you're subsidizing affordable housing, and we say absolutely. It's a great deal. And now you have a comp at $65,000. Maybe next time, first of all, it's an affordable unit for someone to buy, which is a great thing. But it also helps establish a market because right now in a neighborhood like where that picture was taken, there's no comparables on the market because there's no market to buy. So now you've got a sale of $65,000 this year, maybe it's $70,000 next year. It's still affordable.
Yep.
And that was all done through grant money. So it's a very efficient way to bring a unit before it had to be demolished back to market and get that market going, build the By the way, in that same neighborhood, they're doing other things. So they did a street mural in front of a school, did huge events. We had 300 people at the event. So part of this is what we call neighborhood confidence, whether it's a demolition that's necessary, which is also taking place in the same neighborhood, or a rehab, or a street mural. They all work to say, you don't have to leave this neighborhood anymore. You can stay in this neighborhood because the city cares about you, the land bank cares about you, and we're going to invest and not just move on.
Yeah. So I really appreciate that perspective of unrestricted, naturally occurring affordable housing. I think that's a critical piece because I think one of the challenges we have when we're building the housing in the first place is that when you have to apply lots of subsidies, it can increase the cost of the redevelopment itself. And so the extent to which you can get a particular structure that has less rehab costs, maybe you don't have to apply as much public dollars or public resource to it and so forth. The other thing I wanted to just kind of highlight that you had mentioned in your slides was this notion of clustering. And so one of the questions that often comes up is, well, how do you structure these land banks to be successful? And one of the key ways you do that is you identify a target area that is compact enough that you can have a discernible impact and you can also manage your resources. We would not recommend trying to identify onesie, twosie properties sort of scattered across a broad geography because the physical logistics of keeping track of those properties is very difficult. And the ability to demonstrate any kind of significant impact is also going to be limited. Whereas if you, as Scott mentioned, you're talking about stacking a demolition, a rehab, a community garden, as Vicky points out, the pottery location is a potential buffer between a residential and a commercial area, so it makes this natural kind of bridge, but it also is a good solution. So it's working in these kind of compact geographies where there's something that's going to really make a difference for that specific area, I think is a really important piece. I wanted to just address a couple of the questions that came in the chat. So one of the questions had to do with whether or not you have to have a home rule member. And there's another question that had to do with how do you work with the land banks if you're in an area that's geographically pretty far apart from existing land banks. And then the third question was about overlapping jurisdictions. And so I wanted to try to address those all just pretty quickly. The purpose of or the benefit of having a home rule member is that the home rule authority has the ability to basically set its own rules as opposed to having to follow the rules that are set by the state for all non-home rule communities. So you have a lot more discretion, a lot more autonomy to make decisions. Related to that is home rule authority can be extended anywhere in the state of Illinois. So if you're located in an area that does not have a home rule community or does not have a land bank that has home rule membership, you can partner with a land bank that could be 200 miles away, but as long as they have the legal authority under the IGA to come work in your community, you can bring those services to bear without really having to do a whole lot of extra work. And then the third question, or the question relates to overlapping geographies. I would say generally speaking, and Scott, you can correct me, but I think generally speaking, the only places where it overlaps is Cook County and South Suburban Land Bank Authority are the ones that overlap. Everyone else is kind of geographically distinct. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So let me go to a question that came in, which I think is going to be important, especially for many of our elected officials, which is how do you control this thing? How do decisions get made? Who's in charge of disposing of these properties? So I don't know, Vicky, maybe I know we're talking about governance structures quite a bit with Prairie Hills. Do you want to kind of explain to folks how land banks are governed and how decisions get made?
I can tell you what our plan is. I was
Yeah.
actually just typing a response to that question. So what we are doing is we are giving every municipality and county who joins our land bank a seat on the board. So they get one representative. It doesn't matter how big they are, if they are a city, a village, a county, everybody gets equal voice, and that voice is counted at one at this point. So the intention is at least like a 5-person board would be my minimum request. But everybody gets a single vote. And then that particular person who is representing their community has the authority from that community to make decisions for those properties in their municipality. So Macomb has elected an individual to be their voting member, if you will, and that particular person works in an office where he would be able to make decisions for the county or the city so that they don't constantly have to go back and forth, that our board can get things done in a more efficient manner. We're not constantly revisiting city councils asking permission. The functionality of the whole thing is that that particular board member has to agree and approve working on that property. They just because they've signed on to the land bank doesn't mean I can just go and like start doing things without them signing off on it. They still maintain control over their municipality's properties, but they have the ability to say for their city or their municipality, yes, work on this space. We want to do this thing. And so hopefully that will allow us to be a little bit more efficient. The IGA covers some of those relationships, but then the more nitty gritty details are in the document we're currently working on for policy and procedure updates, kind of documenting on how we make decisions as a land bank staff, or as myself as their agent or their manager, if you will, to be able to go and move on those properties.
Let me just add a quick footnote, and I'm looking
Yeah.
at the time here. Is the way yours is being structured as most of the land banks in Illinois, is the IGA, you only have to go to once. Once that member, in your case, there's also contribution associated with that, joins the IGA, then either your bylaws or your policy procedures can just be amended by the board. So it's a really efficient system that's set up in Illinois that you all join initially, but then you're delegating that authority to the board.
Yeah, thank you for that, Scott, because I was going to say there's kind of this hierarchical relationship in some respects. The another question that came in is related to what is the organizational structure of a land bank? Does it have to be governmental or can it be non-governmental? If you're using an IGA model, which we would recommend, it's going to be a governmental entity formed by pooling the resources of the member governments. You can have organizations that execute the actions of the land bank. So in this case, Vicky's organization is a nonprofit. She's serving as the operational manager of the land bank, but the land bank itself is formed as a governmental unit or as an intergovernmental unit. Depending on which states you look at, some land banks, they require them to be governmental units. Some states, they require them to be nonprofits. Some states, they have kind of a hybrid model. So in Illinois, our recommendation would be that you form it as an IGA, and then you can either contract out, hire your own staff. That's, as Scott says, the decision making is going to flow back to the IGA, and then from the IGA to its board, and from its board to its operational framework, and then ultimately to its staff. And so there's that hierarchical relationship. I also just want to emphasize what Vicky shared, which is that this model of having an individual member or members who represent your community having essentially a veto authority at the board over stuff that happens in your community means that a land bank allows you to delegate authority to be efficient and act and not have to go back and forth, but you don't lose control. And that's, I think, a really, really important piece, because one of the questions I think that came up here has to do with what do you do with properties when they reach 2 years of tax delinquency? Or what do you do with properties that the city doesn't currently own or county doesn't own? And so I would ask, in the time we have, maybe if either of you want to reflect, how has it been trying to work with properties that are privately held when you don't have a cooperating owner or you don't have that control or leverage?
From a brownfields perspective, it's very frustrating. I mean, I can give you examples of buildings that we have been trying to get into for 5 years that were shedding brick onto their sidewalk. And you know what thunderstorm season is like in July, and a building fell down at 10 o'clock at night into the street and thankfully missed the brand new building of the business next door. The city was on the hook for $40,000 worth of cleanup because we couldn't get a property owner to actually agree on anything. And the city attorney, that was not her wheelhouse. She wasn't really sure what she was allowed to do in that aspect. Building codes were not exactly something that municipality was keeping up on because they were so small. It's definitely a problem in these rural communities. I'm trying to figure out exactly what your existing tools are, but what the land bank can actually add to it as well. I mean, so for a lot of our municipalities, that's something that's really beneficial. They are looking forward to the fact that they get more staff, they get access to additional experts like Scott or Brent from the last webinar. We're adding resources at this point for, in my opinion, what is a pretty low cost. And I think a lot of our municipalities agree that it's frustrating.
The community that had to spend $40,000 on cleanup, do you know what their membership would be if they were to join the land bank?
$2,460.
So again, the scale of $2,460 for preventative medicine versus $40,000 to do a cleanup,
and that is one building, and they
right.
probably have 10 more.
Right. So I know we're out of time. I wanted to say for the folks that did not get their questions answered, we have documented them. We can follow up. I know a couple people have asked about our contact information, so myself and Scott have posted it. Maybe Vicky, if you could put your contact information in the chat, and then I'm going to turn it back to Mike to kind of wrap us up. And just want to thank everybody who participated, and especially Scott and Vicky for your presentations and for sharing your experiences. I think it was really informative. So thank you. Mike, I don't see you. Are you here?
I am here, Brian.
All right.
Uh,
Thank you.
Brian, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Vicky. I am going to take a quick moment just before folks leave to launch a quick poll that they can perhaps share their impressions with us. Also, a couple observations. First, as I noted last time, please remember that this presentation and related materials aren't intended to deliver legal advice or tax advice. So as always, be sure to consult with attorneys and other advisors about your community's particular needs and options. As I mentioned earlier, if you registered for the webinar, you will receive links to program materials in a follow-up email. If you're not already receiving our email notices about upcoming webinar offerings, please drop your email into the chat before you go, and we'll add you to the email list so you'll get those materials. For example, coming up next Monday from 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m., please join us for a pretty important program given the circumstances for an Illinois Office of Broadband program with an overview of the changes to the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program known as BEAD and the rerunning of the grantee selection round following NTIA's publication of the BEAD restructuring policy notice. Really important for anybody who has participated in some of the work over the last year or two with respect to broadband rollout here in the state. Finally, as always, I want to invite you to visit our website at go.illinois.edu/LGE to access our video archives of prior presentations on a wide variety of community development topics. Finally, again, on behalf of the University of Illinois Extension and rural partners, I want to thank Brian, Vicky, and Scott for these presentations today and for their help in making this webinar series possible. We greatly appreciate it. Thanks everybody for attending today's webinar. Have a great day, and we hope to see you back for future presentations.
Thank you.